So I think there are two things we can see in this. And by the way, I just want to clarify, in case you didn't know, a couple weeks later, when people were actually able to go in and sort out what had happened in New Orleans, most of the major newspapers and TV media as well carried the story that there was virtually no serious crime in New Orleans that weekend. And this is a city that has a serious crime problem, that has many homicides in a typical weekend. And there were virtually no homicides then. In fact, disaster researchers have gone in there and found that you had an outpouring of pro-social activity by all kinds of people who stopped whatever other activities we might imagine them doing and tried to help and rescue others. At the same time, this terrible scourge of crime story had a disastrous impact on the rescue. You'll remember that helicopters were grounded because of reports of gunfire being targeted at them. I believe many citizens who drowned in their attics in the lower Ninth Ward might have been afraid to leave their homes and seek help because of descriptions of marauding and murderous looters in the streets. So this was a very consequential moment of distortion, if you will. And I think we can see race at work here. We have a long legacy of viewing African Americans through the lens, especially, but other minorities as well, through the lens of crime. It goes back to slavery and has never really ceased to be part of our cultural heritage. But I think that the ferocity and speed with which this story unfolded was more, in a sense, a little bit different than race, at least in the classic sense. It was about crime itself as a familiar narrative for both the media and for politicians in understanding social problems in America. And that is what I've tried to lay out in a book that I've recently published called Governing Through Crime, in which I suggest that crime has moved from being one very important social problem to, in the course of the last several decades, sort of the social problem through which all other social problems get defined. And part of this is about the politics of crime control. Yes, we've had some elections like 1988 and 1994 that seem to turn on crime. But I think it goes a little deeper than just elections. It's really a style of governing. And I've been particularly interested in, some of these PowerPoint slides are animated more than they should be. It began really in the 60s and 70s at the federal level with important executive leaders like Richard Nixon beginning to articulate crime as a particularly decisive problem for America and a very tough punitive response as being a social policy to be preferred. But when it really started to take off in terms of building up the prison population and the kind of cultural resonance that I think crime as an issue has today is when it reached the state houses of America. And I'm going to stay with California here because it's the state that I've studied the most closely. But I'd be curious whether you see parallels to this in Kentucky and other states you're from. So here's a quote from Governor George Deukmejian, who's a Republican governor in the 1980s, late 70s through, basically early 80s through late 80s. And here he is in his last State of the State address, summing up what his contributions were to the state of California. And I was just fascinated by the way he was able, in a very straightforward way, to say, here's what I've done. I've taken a system that had 12 prisons, I've built an additional 14, and I've moved, some 50,000 people from the community into this prison system, and through that I have provided security for the people of California. That is a way of governing California through the promise of a prison system, which I'll show you some data on in a moment, is now far larger than it was in Deukmejian's time. Deukmejian was succeeded by Pete Wilson, who also tended to emphasize crime as a threat. And notice the way he's moving out from just locking folks up to other kinds of social programs, say dealing with unwed pregnancies, that then tie into crime. This is very much what I mean governing through crime, using crime as the rationale and sometimes the model for how you address lots of social problems. Now, many people think this is a story about the rise of the Republican Party and the power of social conservatives in America. I disagree. I think this, in a sense, crime platform, if you will, has been promoted by both parties, supported by liberals as well as conservatives. Now, I'm not saying there aren't differences or nuances in the way they would approach these issues. But the person in my book who I view as the chief executive who most molded these together, governance and crime control, was actually Robert Kennedy in his Justice Department days, when he combined strong work on civil rights with a get-tough attitude on crime symbolized by Jimmy Hoffa in that era. So it's by no means just a Republican issue, and likewise, by the way, is it by no means likely that a new Democratic majority in Congress, should it be sustained, or in the state legislatures, is likely to end this. I think both parties, sort of like the Cold War, have pretty much adopted this as a frame of governance. Now, we recalled Davis, and we elected a new governor who might have been expected to absolutely epitomize this trend. And of course, nothing is perfect in social science. So we ended up, strangely, with a governor who decided that maybe we need to reinvent rehabilitation in California. So go figure. It's hard to predict exactly where the future is going to go. But still, as you see, a big part of his governing agenda is prisons. And if you visit his website, you'll see that the looming California prison crisis is probably the #1 issue he is facing. Anyone here identify this woman? Please. Laura Palmer. Laura Palmer was the murder victim behind the late 80s cult show Twin Peaks. And while most of you probably weren't allowed to watch TV or were still watching Barney when that was on, I think Laura Palmer as murder victim is a familiar face to us. Why? Because one of the key central features of governing through crime is the rise of the victim as a sort of key defining exemplar, if you will, of the citizen. Who is the citizen that government should try to address? In our different parts of our history, we've had yeoman farmers, industrial workers, consumers. I would say in the last 30 years, the crime victim, having long been ignored by the criminal justice system, sort of emerged as central, not just to the criminal justice process, although they are, but to politics more generally. And the reason I think Laura Palmer is so interesting, I mean, there's 10 to 15,000 murder victims a year, so why do you have to pick a fictional one? Well, I think she emblemizes the kinds of victims that have most captured this sense of idealized citizen in need of governmental help, and that is basically a white, young female victim. If you kind of look at popular panics about homicide, they typically have this kind of victim. Now, what's important to me about the rise of the victim is that it's encouraged a certain style of lawmaking. If I was just talking a moment ago about the leader, the executive leader as sort of prosecutor in chief, this is really a story of the lawmaker as, if not victim, at least empathizer with victim. And this comes with a set of themes: trauma, emotion, identity. Lawmaking from the perspective of the victim is not a nuanced question of engineering the most optimal crime control strategies. It's about showing your emotion and your identification with the victim, right? So Michael Dukakis, flunked his screen test in 1988 when he couldn't identify with a murder victim, even when it was his wife. Other politicians have made a major point of identifying with victims, appearing with victims, speaking from victims, but this also influences lawmaking. How many laws can you find in Kentucky and every other state that are named after deceased victims? Megan's Law, Jesse's Law. They're now proliferating, and by the way, they move beyond the human. There's some dog ones for crimes against pets as well. By the way, the Patriot Act is a classic example of kind of crime lawmaking. Everybody was traumatized. It would be outrageous to delay enough to even read the law, so we pass it. And of course, it's packed full of essentially law enforcement tools that have been on the desired list for a long time, have a marginal relationship at best to the particular events of September 11th. But this very much epitomizes the style of lawmaking. And another feature of this is the way in which law actually becomes defined by criminal law, both publicly to the people and also to the media and politicians. So here is a popular New Jersey talk radio host talking about illegal immigration. If you're here illegally, you're breaking the law. No better, no worse than the guy who robs the liquor store or the guy who waits to case your house and robs you of your belongings. You are a criminal. So that kind of identification with law of all kind as criminal law and law breaking of all kinds as criminal, while very selective, right? People who violate, various kinds of technical rules in their businesses may not get defined as easily in this way.